you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. This is so much better than that debate stage. I spent weeks sorry I wasn't going to be there, and then watching it on my way down here, I was so relieved that I wasn't there. It's wonderful to be with you. Just wonderful to be with you. Thank you, Christian. Thank you for that beautiful introduction. Thank you for the generosity. Thank you for the kindness. Thank you for the love that I feel in this room. You know, we are living in an extraordinary moment. We're living in a very critical moment. We're living in the kind of times, much as one of our founders, Thomas Paine said, these are times that try men's souls. And in many ways, these are times that try men's and women's souls. And our question, the deepest question that each and every one of us can ask ourselves is, how do I most correctly inhabit this time and this space? Because life is not just about what happens to us. Life is about who we choose to be in the space of what happens to us. And that is as true. And that is as true for us collectively as it is true for us individually. You know, I did a podcast today where the host said, you've been involved with spirituality for so long. Why would you want to take something as beautiful and pure as spirituality and connect it to something as crude and dark as politics? You've been thinking that too. But what I said to him and what I say to you is the problem is that we have to even think of politics as something crude and dark. All that politics should be is our collective behavior. The word politics comes from the root politeia, which means of the people. If one individual should live a life where we're trying to be good, and we're trying to do good things, and we're trying to align ourselves with what Abraham Lincoln called the angels of our better nature, and we're asking ourselves, what does it mean to live in integrity? What does it mean to live in goodness? What does it mean to live in kindness? What does it mean to live in mercy? What does it mean to live in justice? What does it mean to live in compassion? And that, I believe, is the core inquiry of the average American. Whether people think of those questions in a religious context, a spiritual context, or a purely secular context, I do think most of us try to live good lives and ask ourselves those deeper questions. Did I treat that person right? What is the right thing to do? That's what we talk about in our lives. Do you think that was the right thing that I did, etc.? The problem is that we've stopped asking those things about our collective experience. We have taken the question, what is it to be good? What does it mean to be loving? What does it mean to be correct? And we have limited that level of questioning to our private sphere. Politics should simply be the public sphere, and the inquiry should be the same. What does it mean to be good? And we can't be great if we're not good. So we shouldn't just ask, so we shouldn't just be asking, is my behavior good? We should also be asking, is our behavior good? And we also know that if we are in any position of power as individuals, then we have even more responsibility to ask that question. And given that we are the most powerful country in the world, we must take responsibility for the power. We must take responsibility for that fact. And we must ask ourselves, is our economic system good? Is it just? Is our criminal justice system good? Is it just? Is our environmental policy good? Is it just? Is our educational policy good? Is it just? Is the way we treat our children good? Is it just? Is the way we interact with other countries good? Is it just? And if you and I are not asking that question, who do you think is going to be answering it? The founders were onto something very profound when they said the power is in our hands. But power is not in our hands if it's not in our head. And power is not in our hands if it's not in our heart. And so we have allowed ourselves the convenience of distraction. We have allowed ourselves the ultimate convenience of chronic political disengagement, and sometimes we've had the audacity to call that spiritual. Sometimes we've said that it's so toxic, you know. I don't want to participate in something that toxic. And so that means some of the most forward-thinking, most enlightened thinkers in America haven't wanted anything to do with politics, you know, because it's so toxic. So then you remove more and more forward-thinking, enlightened people, which makes it more toxic, which means the most enlightened, most forward-thinking people even want to be more disconnected from it until you get to where we got, where everybody's going, oh shit, we better do something. You know, Winston Churchill is famous for having said that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. It is true, there are many people rolling their eyes about America all around the world because they just kind of don't understand what we're thinking. How could you have let all this happen? But those same people, if they know anything about history, also know this, that if you look throughout our history, it is true that sometimes Americans did take a while to get around to really doing the right thing, but when we do, oh, we slam it like nobody's business, and we are going to slam it now. You know, it's not like Americans don't know what's going on. It's not like Americans haven't known what's going on. I could talk to you all night tonight about millions of chronically traumatized children in this country, 13 million hungry children in America, 100,000 homeless children in America. I could talk to you about the fact that at least a third of Americans live with chronic economic anxiety in the richest country in the world. I could talk to you about the fact that millions of Americans live with this constant gnawing, what will happen if I get sick? What will happen if one of my kids gets sick? How will I ever send my kids to college? What will I do to ever get out from under these college loans? I could talk to you about the fact that our national security agenda is dominated more by defense contractors who are trying to shore up their profits than by the actual security needs of the United States of America. I could talk to you about the underlying racial turbulence of the United States stemming from such racial injustice in criminal sentencing, et cetera. I could talk to you about a critical problem with climate change, which is so bad that if we do not make massive repair and quickly, then we could have a level of mass social collapse within 12, 15, 20 years, unlike anything we have ever seen in the modern era. We could see entire swaths of countries, entire swaths of continents uninhabitable because of the heat, places where food cannot be grown, places where people simply cannot be, and therefore they seek to leave, thus creating a refugee crisis of hundreds of millions of people if we're not careful, so that there is a level of trauma and global catastrophe unlike anything we have ever seen. But this is the deal, ladies and gentlemen. Even if I were to say all these things and give you more details, there's basically not any of that you don't already know. You see, this isn't a time where we all have to say to each other, wake up, you got to understand what's going on. We understand what's going on. And we have understood what was going on, and we chose to look away from what was going on, and what was going on got worse and worse because we looked away, and now we're not actually looking away from what's going on. We all know, in essence, what's going on. This is not the time to say to each other, oh, do you know what's going on? This is the time to say to each other, come on, we need some courage. We can do this. We're not going through anything other generations have not gone through. This is a country that had slavery. But the point was, this is a country that also had an abolitionist movement. This is a country that had the institutionalized suppression of women. But that's not the only point. The point is that this country also had the women's suffragette movement. This is a country that had institutionalized white supremacy and segregation in the American South. But that's not the only point. The point is also that we had the civil rights movement. You see, the United States, from our very, very beginning, has been this odd dichotomy between the most enlightened and aspirational principles that have ever formed the founding of a country and the fact that from our very beginning, we have also included forces that have been the most violent perpetrators of transgression against the principles on which we purport to stand. It was there in 1776 when 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence risked their lives to establish these extraordinary principles, a repudiation of an aristocracy that had been dominating the Western world for centuries. A radical repudiation, a radical statement, a statement which would have gotten all of those signers executed as traitors if, in fact, the British had won the war. And those principles form our mission statements. The problem is that we have lost our psychological and emotional bonding to our mission statement. Those principles are inscribed on marble walls and they're written on parchment. But if they're not inscribed in our hearts, generation after generation, they die. They lose their moral force. Principles aren't alive unless they're alive in our hearts. In the Jewish religion, it says every generation must discover God for itself. And every generation of Americans must discover not only our principles, but our rambunctiousness in order to make sure they remain safe in our time. Now let's go back to 1776, and let's go back to those 56 men who risked their lives to sign those declarations. We can't forget the fact that 41 of them were slave owners. And that's where our story begins, that bipolar quality, that dichotomy, the fact that we have always been both. The issue is that every generation decides what is the story that we will make the chapter of our time in this ongoing, unfolding drama. Will we be the slave owners, or will we be the abolitionists? And in our generation, just as in every generation, we have the forces that represent both sides of that coin. You know, I read a book by Sue Monk Kidd. She wrote, of course, The Secret Life of Bees. And she also wrote an incredible book called The Invention of Wings. And The Invention of Wings is a fictionalized account of the lives of two women who actually lived, called the Grimke sisters. And the Grimke sisters were born into a slave-owning family in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, that book made me think about a lot of things I'd never thought about before. The Grimke sisters were two people, and there were many people like the Grimke sisters, who were born into slave-owning families, slave-owning communities, whose eyes were opened to where they actually were and what they were actually doing. We all know the song Amazing Grace, which is, of course, the most eloquent expression of that phenomenon. They were converted by the Quakers into the abolitionist cause and ultimately became two leading abolitionists and two leading feminists. Now, what that book made me think about was the difference between being anti-slavery and being an abolitionist. Because being anti-slavery just meant you didn't agree with it. Being anti-slavery just meant, I would never do that. Being anti-slavery just meant, I think people who do that are like so crazy and so wrong, and I would never live there. But that of itself, while a noble sentiment, would not have moved the needle for one enslaved person. But then there were some, and ultimately there were many, who crossed a bridge. And that bridge is inside us. It's a psychological bridge. It's an emotional bridge. It's a spiritual bridge. It's a moral bridge. They went from, I don't agree with it, to where we have to go now. It's not enough to not agree. We have to get to that place now, not on my watch. You know, most of us in America today, unfortunately, are very familiar with a certain kind of conversation. It's a conversation that we're familiar with because either we have made this phone call, or the phone call has been made to us, or for some of us, the conversation was made about us. And it goes something like this. Did you see Sarah at the party last night? Yeah, I was there. You saw that she fell down the stairs, right? Yeah, I saw her. Did anybody else see? Yeah, there were several of us. You think we need to do something? Yeah, I was thinking that too. I don't know who to call, do you? I have a sister in California. I think she knows some interventionist person. Now, that phone call means that we know it in our gut when it's gone too far. Drugs, alcohol, we know that place, we know that time. And usually the other person was thinking the same thing because we all know. And we've all experienced enough to know that because of drugs and alcohol and so much that everybody knows today, the survival of the physical body cannot be guaranteed. You abuse it too much, and it no longer becomes a container for physical life. People know that. We know that. We know what an intervention means. It means I can't be quiet. Because if I'm quiet now, you could die. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to get out of our magical thinking. Because just as there is no guarantee that the physical body will survive if you abuse it enough, there's no guarantee that democracy will survive either. And there is no guarantee that life on earth will survive if we continue to abuse this planet. Now, that moment when people realize we need to do something, nobody's jumping up and down, all excited and all cheerful. We know that something very serious is going on. And I've had a 35-year career working with people in their times of crisis. People don't usually come to me because things are going well. Many people in this room have careers as therapists, clergy, healers. And you work with people in those times that are difficult. In my own life, it might be somebody who just heard back from the doctor. The test results came back, and it's cancer. It might be someone who was just told their child is an addict, and it's heroin. It might be someone who was just told by their spouse or their partner, it's over, I'm gone. It might be someone who's told your business it's over, or they're bankrupt. But I've seen something very interesting, and I think we all have, because life experience has shown this to us. It's often when people are their most noble, their most intelligent, is when they were given the bad news. Sometimes, you're given the bad news, and in the first 5 minutes, all the most unimportant, ultimately meaningless stimulus that so often dominates our lives just falls away. And all of a sudden, we become very clear about what's important. We become very clear about what's real and what's meaningful. And we become very focused, and we become very noble, and we become very intelligent. Why? Because we are noble and we are intelligent. But you don't expect the doctor to lie to you about the test results. If the test results came back bad, the doctor has to tell you the truth. In the same way, a political leader should tell you the truth. Because if you don't have a doctor who's going to say, this is how bad it is, then you don't know to then say to the doctor, okay, what are we going to do? And then the healing options avail themselves, and we get through crises. And that's what political leadership should be too. It should be someone telling you the truth. Because if things aren't good, we have to recognize that they're not good. If we have to intervene, we need to intervene. If the test results aren't so good, we need to get that the test results aren't good. But we have a politics of people-pleasing. We have a politics where people are less interested in telling the truth and more interested in saying what we think you need to hear or you want to hear, because I assume all you care about is yourself. I assume all you care about is yourself. So I've read up on what I think your group wants. I've read up on what I think your group wants. I've read up on what I think your group wants. And then I'm going to say, I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to you, and I'm going to give it to you, and you're just a poker chip. And that's how the American people have been infantilized. We're not talked to like we're noble. We're not talked to like we're intelligent. We're not even talked to us like we're adults. But we are adults, and we better start acting like it, or this whole thing could go down. Now, my experience, not only all over this country and many places of the world for the last 35 years, my experience even with, and particularly with people in crisis, has given me great faith in the American people. I love Americans. I think Americans are great. Whenever I travel internationally, I always I'm all excited when I'm sitting next to an American on an airplane. I don't think we're better than anybody else, but I think we're as good as anybody else. And like I said, I think we're dignified and decent people. The problem is not with the American people. The problem is not with the consciousness of the American people. The problem is that the United States government does not now reflect the consciousness, the will, the goodness, the dignity, or the decency of the American people. Now, first, we all need to take responsibility for our part in that. As I said earlier, it was pretty convenient being left out, wasn't it? It was kind of convenient to standing on the sidelines. You could know, but you didn't have to do anything about what you knew. Didn't really have to get any grit under your, dirt under your fingernails. Didn't really have to have people saying all terrible things about you all the time. You didn't have to go through the processes that it takes to stand up in such a moment as this. I hear a lot of people saying that this is a very traumatizing moment. I'm just so traumatized by everything that's happening. I'm so traumatized by this president. I'd like to say right here, right now, whoever you are, we do not have time for you to complete your trauma work before you show up for your country. Women of America, we are not little girls. And men of America, you're not little boys. And the infantilization of the average American has really got to stop. You think the people who walked across the bridge at Selma weren't traumatized? They didn't know if they were going to send out the dogs. They didn't know if they were going to send out the hoses. They didn't know if they were going to send out the bullets. And yet they walked. Do you know what happened to the women's suffragettes who were thrown in prison for marching, just marching so that women could have a right to vote? So they're thrown into prison, and the conditions in the prison were so terrible that they went on a hunger strike. And the reaction of the prison administration was to send men into their cells with these metal contraptions that they forced onto their necks to force feed them. You think they were a little stressed and anxious about the whole thing? As I said before, we're not going through anything other generations didn't go through. But they showed a fierce determination and a devotion to our democracy and a love of future generations that we would do well to display in our time. Somebody was saying to me today about some negative tweets that he had put something on the internet. It was a story about some immigrants from Guatemala. And he said, it was a beautiful story about a woman coming over here with her children. He said, I got 2 or 3 positive comments, but then I got all these negative, nasty comments. Why did she even come here? She shouldn't even come here. She was endangering the life of the child. And it was so interesting. Social media has given us such a skewed view of things. Even when we passed civil rights legislation, segregation has still existed. Even when we freed the slaves and abolished slavery, there were still people who thought slavery was a good idea. We've got to stop caring too much if people don't agree with you. If everything you say is getting applause all the time, you're probably not yet saying all the right stuff. And there are some things that we need to say. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, your life begins to end on the day you stop talking about things that matter. There are some things that really matter. All this business about all people are created equal? We have to ask ourselves, do we mean that? This business about how God gave all men inalienable rights of life and of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Do we mean that? Because if we mean that, how can there be millions of American children who go to school hungry and ask their teachers every day if they have some food for them? If every American is supposedly to have the right given by God to the pursuit of happiness, and it's the government's function to secure those rights, and if the government is not doing that job, we have the right to alter it or to abolish it, how come millions of American children are going to classrooms every single day where they do not even have the adequate school supplies with which to teach a child to read? And if a child cannot learn to read by the age of 8, the chances of high school graduation are drastically decreased, and the chances of incarceration are drastically increased. Where do we go with that in our minds? And you can't look away from it. That's not transcendence, that's denial. We don't want to practice negative denial. Negative denial is, well, there's really nothing I can do, because if you're an American, there's so much you can do. None of this like negative denial. We want to practice positive denial. Positive denial is, oh, we see the fact that 43 million Americans are hungry. We see the fact that millions of American children, for no other reason than that their parents do not have money, are denied a quality public school education in America because of the immoral way that we base our educational funding primarily on property taxes, which, when you think about it, in the richest country in the world is actually a passive form of oppression. Oh, we see that. We see the fact that the United States, for the sake of a $360 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia, is willing to give aerial support to a war that Saudi Arabia is waging against Yemen, in which tens of thousands of people are starving. Many of them are children. A war that, with the idea of America participating in such a thing, much less for the sake of an arms deal, would have made our grandparents roll over in their graves. Oh, we see that. The fact that we are continuing to treat the planet in ways that are almost sure to create global catastrophe at some point down the road, even if it's not global catastrophe for us. So uninhabitable will be huge swaths of countries, huge swaths of continents, where the heat is so great people can't live there, where the food cannot be grown, where the environmental refugees are there. No, we see that. You see, ladies and gentlemen, it's time to practice positive denial. Not negative denial where you look away, but positive denial where you look right at it and go, I deny your power. You see, until we know who we are and claim the power of who we are, that's a very difficult thing to do. And I think it's very interesting and to be noted in such a place as this, that the abolitionist movement in the United States emerged from the early evangelicals and Quakers. And many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers. And Dr. King, of course, was a Baptist preacher who led the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Why do I mention that? I mention that because throughout America's history, when there have been major course corrections, when the United States has swerved so much from soulfulness, swerved from goodness, swerved from decency, had been lured into the evil of institutions such as slavery, such as oppression, such as segregation, it was always those in spiritual and religious communities who spoke up first. And why is that? There's a reason for that. Because the religious and the spiritual life gives you two powers that the mortal mind alone cannot give. One is the power of your no, and one is the power of your yes. The power of your no is, at a certain point, it's got to stop. You know, we all know that famous line from Edmund Burke that the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for enough good men to do nothing. At a certain point, it is the calling of the soul. As I was saying before, it's not enough to know. It's not enough to know you have to say something. It's not enough to know you've got to do something. It's that fierce no. The fierceness of love. You know, in every advanced mammalian species that survives and thrives, a common anthropological characteristic is the fierce behavior of the adult female of the species when she senses a threat to her cubs. If you ever go, let's say, hiking in the wilderness, let's say, in a state such as Montana, someplace like that, here even California, where they have black bears. We've all heard it in those situations. Oh, the black bears are fine. They won't mess with you. If you don't mess with them, just stay away from their babies. Because if you go near their babies, they're coming after you. That's how nature operates. We protect the children. What does it say about the women of our country? What does it say about the women of our world? Because 12,000 babies are starving every day, and there's no dearth of food. Millions of American children, thank God we're not starving, but they are hungry. Millions of American children are living in what's called America's domestic war zones, where psychologists say that the PTSD of a returning veteran from Afghanistan or Iraq is no more severe than the PTSD of these children. We should be rescuing these children no differently than if they were the victims of a natural disaster, because they are a humanitarian emergency. But the political establishment has simply normalized their despair, because they're not old enough to vote, so they're not a constituency, and they're not old enough to work, so there's no financial leverage, so they can't compete with the cloud of all the corporate money that floods Washington. Because first, short-term profits for health insurance companies and big pharmaceutical companies and gun manufacturers and defense contractors and chemical companies and oil and gas companies, first they get their short-term profits, then we'll talk about whether there's enough money to feed the children. Are we going to be quiet about that? We're going to look away from that? We're going to say, oh, well, I don't know, people who they just know more about these things than I do. Is that what we're going to do? Are we going to justify it and somehow call that spiritual? There's nothing holy about complacency, and there's nothing negative about yelling fire if, in fact, the house is burning down. So you see, ladies and gentlemen, it is time for us to say, at a certain point, you say no. At a certain point, you say no. There was nothing further to say to the institution of slavery. The abolitionists, there was nothing further to say. The abolitionists did not ask themselves, well, is it possible to end slavery? Did they ask themselves, is it reasonable to think it could ever be done to end slavery? Did they ask themselves whether it was politically feasible to think that it could be done to end slavery? Did they think, well, they have the money and they have the power, so we couldn't possibly do it? No, they said no. But they had something else. They didn't just have the power of no. They also had the power of yes. They had the power of knowing that beyond this world, there's another possibility. That in the space of what humanity should be, in the space of love, so much more is possible. So even though they had not seen an America without slavery, they said yes to the possibility that it could be. And that's what you and I have to do. We're not even imagining anymore a world at peace. We're not even imagining anymore a planet repaired. We're not even imagining a country in which all the children are fed. We're not even imagining a country in which everyone is able to soar and thrive. And we're certainly not imagining a planet in which those things are true. And yet, you see, ladies and gentlemen, all those things are possible. Not only are all those things possible, all those things are the natural expression of us when we are in our natural state. You know, when Abraham Lincoln talked about the angels of our better nature, he didn't think he was being metaphorical, because that was before the advent of modern psychotherapy. So if it was, let's say, 200 years ago, and you were talking about what we would, the equivalent of racism, bigotry, anti-Semitism, homophobia, and you were talking to someone 200 years ago about such things as the equivalent of that, they would say, oh, you mean demons. And if you said, yes, but then there's also hope and faith and love and justice and kindness and forgiveness, they would have said, yes, angels. And we have had the arrogance to think we had things figured out more deeply than they did. Really? So when Abraham Lincoln talked about the angels of our better nature, he meant the character, the truth of who we are. Because in our own collective experience, just like in our own individual experiences, we make a choice. It's simply a choice. We all know the story of the Native American being told that each of us has two animals within us. And the young boy said to his grandfather, which one wins? He said, these two animals are struggling. He said, who wins is which one you feed. We know this in our individual lives. We must now take up the mantle of citizenship. We must recognize that we all have acquiesced to a situation where we as citizens are disempowered, but it's not just that power has been taken from us, we have given it away by not using it. We have given it away by not using it. We have given it away by not taking a stand. We have given it away because we thought, well, I love my own kids. The love that will save the world, ladies and gentlemen, is not just love for your own kids. The love that will save the world is also love for the children on the other side of town. The love that will save the world. The love that will save the world is not just the love for our own children or children on the other side of town. The love that will save the world is love for the children on the other side of the world. You know, some people say I'm very naive. That I'm very naive, you know, to say, well, actually, we should be expressing love collectively, just like we should express love individually. People say I'm very naive to say, actually, all public policy, both domestic and international, should actually be aligned around one core principle. And that is not economic, it's humanitarian. It should be based around one core principle. What would help people thrive? What would help people thrive? What would help people thrive? Because when people thrive, people are happy. People are better, people are creative, and people are productive. And that's when they have happy relationships and happy families and happy streets. That's when they have happy communities. That's when people produce, and that's where money comes from. That's where peace and prosperity come from. You know, when I was a kid, politicians actually talked about peace and prosperity. And so I said to myself a few years ago, I wonder why they don't talk about peace and prosperity anymore. And my first thought was, oh, Marianne, you're kind of old-fashioned, honey. They don't talk about peace and prosperity anymore because it's a cliche. I said to myself, that's not why they don't discuss it. They don't discuss it because it's not the goal anymore. If the goal were peace, then we would be helping people thrive. Because desperate people, the biggest national security risk is large groups of desperate people. Desperate people do desperate things. Desperate people should be seen as a national security risk. But no, we're so busy preparing for war, we're not waging peace. Because there are really no corporate profits in waging peace. Because let me tell you how you wage peace. You wage peace by expanding economic opportunities for women. You wage peace by expanding educational opportunities for children. You wage peace by reducing violence against women. You wage peace by ameliorating unnecessary human suffering. And that's why... That's why we should have a United States Department of Peace that works side by side with the Defense Department. We put a burden on our military that the military should not meant to carry. You can't just say to the doctor, I'm not going to take care of my body, I'm not going to exercise, I'm not going to cultivate my health, but hey, if I get sick, hey, doc, you handle it. That's how we treat the military. But sickness is the absence of health. Health is not the absence of sickness. You can't just take medicine, you also have to cultivate health. And you can't just endlessly prepare for war. You also have to cultivate peace. You have to wage peace. War is the absence of peace. Peace is not the absence of war. But we're not even talking about it. We're not even talking about it. So disconnected have we become. And we're not only so disconnected from it, we're actually acquiescing to a political system that's not talking to us about it either. How long do you think this can last? So you see, people think I'm very naive to say there should be a Department of Children and Youth because we need more than just more educational funding as much as we need that. We need more than smaller class sizes as much as we need that. We need more than just to remove high-stakes testing from the classrooms and to give the art of teaching back to teachers as much as we need that. But these children, we have children who are traumatized before preschool. We have elementary school students in this country who are on suicide watch. We need trauma-informed education. We need community wraparound services. We need mental health counselors, not only for children, but also for the families. We need restorative justice. We need conflict resolution. We need mindfulness in the schools. We have a political system that's talking like it's the 20th century, that's talking talking in this Newtonian mechanistic model of if we just tweak the pieces of the machine enough, it will be okay. If we just treat the symptoms enough, it will be okay. We don't have to talk about the cause, because if we really talk about the cause, we'll have to talk about how much money goes to the very things that cause these problems. Ladies and gentlemen, it is time for an intervention. It is time for the people to step in. In 1776, when we repudiated an aristocracy, in all the ways that I've already mentioned, the bravery that it took, and the mistakes, obviously more than mistakes, the evils that were present even then. The mistake we made, I think, was considering it a done deal. It's kind of like if we said, well, I was healthy in 2013, so I didn't know I had to think about my health after that. It's like saying, well, my marriage was in good shape 5 years ago, so I didn't think I had to think about it anymore. It's like saying, well, I took care of my business 5 years ago, so why should I have to think about it now? If you don't take care about your health, you might get sick. If you don't take care of your marriage, you might lose it. If you don't take care of your business, you might lose it. And it turns out that the American Revolution is an ongoing process. It turns out that every generation has to ask ourselves, do I mean this? Do we mean this? Because just like when you wake up in the morning, you have to ask yourself, am I giving my life to love? Am I giving my life to be a conduit to the good, the true, and the beautiful? Am I sending my love before me? Am I giving my life in service to something good and true and loving? And what we learn in life is that if you don't do that, then the energy that might have gone in that direction will go in the direction of neurosis and pathology. That's what you learn. The energy is going to go somewhere. Well, that's how power drives. Power is going to go somewhere. So when you have the richest country in the world, if our power is not dedicated to the cultivation of all men are created equal, if our power is not dedicated to the cultivation of true justice, if our power is not dedicated to the cultivation of moral leadership, to that which is good, to really being the light that we know that we are capable of being, then why are we so surprised that that power has been usurped? And why are we acting like children about this? Why are we pretending that what is true is what we know is not true, and that what is not true, what we know is true? The billions and billions and billions of dollars that are actually made as profit centers on people's suffering. We must be very adult at this time. And those of us in any kind of transformational community, we're not people who only talk about things that don't matter. We talk about people who are sick. We talk about people who are addicted. We talk about people who are losing their marriages. We don't act like children in our personal lives, but we've had enough experience now. We've seen how our lives transform, but we've seen that if our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to get real. If our lives are going to have to transform, we're going to have to get honest. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to look in the mirror. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to be brutally honest with ourselves. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to admit our character defects. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to take our own fearless moral inventory. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to atone about some things where we know we haven't cleaned up some stuff from the past. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to make some amends that still need to be made. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to stop with the pretending that we don't know what we do know. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to be willing to rise to the occasion. If our lives are going to transform, then we're going to have to claim our own strength and our own power. If our lives are going to transform, we're going to have to own where we've acted like we were children when we're not children anymore. And we're going to have to own the fact that if we act like children, then the people who will suffer in our midst are the children. The children have a right to be children, but they will not be treated correctly if we're acting like children rather than adults. But we have to do for our country now the very things that I just said. And the reason in today's world, so many people in places like this, transformational centers, spiritual centers, churches, people who are involved. You know, somebody said to me once, early in my campaign, oh, Ms. Williamson, how are you going to not be perceived as just within this religious box? You know, I don't know where we get this whole idea of categories, as though there are these categories. I remember my father, when we were children, he would make us look at the globe, and he would point out, God didn't draw a line between France and Spain. God didn't draw a line between the United States and Mexico. These are all lines that we drew. And we have these categories of life that are all just man-made. They don't actually exist. So when people said to me, Ms. Williamson, how are you going to not be perceived as somebody who's just in a religious or a spiritual box? I remember thinking to myself, well, 90% of Americans say they believe in God. So I said to myself, I think I said to them too, I can't remember. If everybody who is either religious or spiritual, in psychotherapy, goes to AA, goes to yoga, goes to meditate, listens to me, I think I'll win. Somebody said to me earlier today, how do you convince the American people to be noble? How do you convince the American people to be charitable? How do you convince the American people to be compassionate? How do you convince the American people to be intelligent? Ladies and gentlemen, the American people are those things. What we need is to be talked to and given the opportunity to act that way collectively. The problem with our political establishment is that it's stuck in the 20th century somewhere. We have people today, and I'll tell you something, we have millions of people who will be voting in this next presidential election who weren't even born in the 20th century. And they should not be burdened by the ideas that were the bad ones in the 20th century. And there are millions and millions of Americans who, even if they were born in the 20th century, will not be living the majority of their lives in the 20th century. The imperatives of the 21st century are different. We are whole person thinkers now. We are holistic thinkers now. We are integrative thinkers now. This is the 21st century. We have influenced this kind of thinking, and many people in spiritual communities have a lot to be proud of. I always say all that yoga mat stuff. Where do you think that came from? Our crowd. You know, all that mindfulness stuff. Where do you think that came from? Our crowd. And then people are saying, well, I don't want to go into politics because it's so toxic. The only reason it's toxic is because we haven't gone there yet. And so we have a political establishment, and when I say this, I do not mean the candidates themselves, because I know as someone who is running for president, these are very lovely people. I'm not running against anyone, I'm running with very good people. This is not about individuals who are running. That's not what this is about. This is about a whole larger, quite corrupted system, if I may say so. And it's very stuck in 20th century. And so then it projects onto what is actually the thinking of millions and millions and millions of people like we're just fringe. They project onto love that loves wackadoodle, woo-woo. Although actually that's not even true. They don't project onto the loving thinker that we're wackadoodle or woo-woo. They just say that because they know we're not. And so there is this projection onto people who come from an internal sense of organic unfoldment of love, that love actually should be the bottom line, and that we don't apologize for it. That love should guide our individual lives, and we don't apologize for that. And the idea that love should guide our collective lives, why should we apologize for that either? All that a country is a collection of people. So if love should guide my life, why shouldn't love guide our lives? Why wouldn't it be the best thing to cultivate love and peace, to feed children? Why are we continuing to buy into this old paradigm that we all know is putrid? Of course this is outside the box. The only answer is outside the box. The box itself is saturated with false and illusion. And it is time. Now, there are far more lovers than haters in this country. And there are far more lovers than haters in this world. But we've got a problem on our hands, ladies and gentlemen, because the haters have become political. And the haters in this country have become political. And they're effective, and they're organized, and they're convicted, and conviction is a force multiplier. The issue is not that there are more haters than lovers. The issue is that those of us who love must show as much conviction now as do those who hate. So we have two problems on our hands. One is an amoral economic system. It's not an immoral economic system. It's just an amoral economic system. It's not made up of people who wake up in the morning and decide what to do to hurt children. That's not what's going on. It's just a system of thought which sees the hurting child as not its responsibility, because its only responsibility is short-term profits for huge multinational corporate interests. This whole trickle-down economic theory that has had 40 years to prove itself, and which has not lifted all boats. It has left millions and millions of people without a life vest. We know all this. The issue now is, who are we going to be in the space of all these things that we know? We know that this country needs to look at things. We need to look at the history of race, and we need to repair. We need to look at our history with Native Americans, and we need to repair. We need to atone, and we need to make amends. We need to feed the children. We need to deal with a criminal justice system in which there was terrible racial disparity. We need to pay reparations when reparations should be paid. And we need to declare peace. We need to wage peace. We need to bring all of our public policy into alignment with the angels of our better nature. And the fact that our public policy is so often not aligned with the angels of our better nature just means that we were in process. Bad public policy did this. Just like choices in our own individual lives. You made a bad choice. All of us have made bad choices before. The issue is, what choices are you going to make now? Bad policies got us here. Good policies can change this. But kind of sort of incremental change. We know this from our own personal lives. If you're going to change, you've got to decide to really change. You can't just kind of change a little. Well, I'm leaning into it. I'm trying. No. You know the way you reacted last time? Just don't do it again. I've seen that with my own life. Oh, I've seen it with my own life so many times. Well, I'm trying to figure out why I'm that way, because my mother, because of my father, and my childhood, and what happened when I was 12, and what happened when I was 20, and what happened when I was 25, and then there was that guy, and then I would become very, very good at talking about it. And so if you talk to me, you'd probably think, well, she'll never do that again because she understands why she does it. And what I learned after enough years was, no. The more I could talk a good game about it, it was almost more probable that I would do it again, because I would be able to fool everyone around me to think she probably won't be doing that again, since obviously she understands. And what I came to understand, that at a certain point, it had nothing to do with where it came from. It had nothing to do with who did what. It had to do with Marianne looking in the mirror and saying, oh, just stop it. The way you reacted last time, you don't have to react that way now. And that's the revolutionary spirit that every generation must carry within ourselves. Democracy does not just give us rights, it also gives us responsibilities. It's just like when you are growing up and you come to understand your parents and your family, and you go, what did they do right? And what they did right, I want to continue. I want to make even better. I want to even give to my children better than I got it from my parents. But there are other things our parents might have done, and we go, that was a neurotic pattern, and that one stops now. I'm breaking the chain with it. That is what it is for an individual to individuate. That is what it is for an individual to grow up. That is what it is for an individual to mature. That is what it is for an individual to self-actualize. It is time for our generation together, not just about your issue, but our issues. It is time for us to realize that being a citizen is a big deal. It's like a muscle, and we haven't been using it, and it started to wither away, and we're not in the habit of using it. It means we do not look away. You wouldn't look away if your child were sick. You wouldn't look away if your child was in danger, and we shouldn't look away if our democracy is sick, and we shouldn't look away if our democracy is in danger. We wouldn't say, my child is sick, it's so negative, I don't want to discuss it. No. It's time for every American woman to be an American woman and not a little girl. It's time for every American man to be an American man and not an American little boy. And it's time for our generation to do what other generations before us have done. And yes, I know it's the 11th hour, but it's very important for all of us to remember it is not midnight yet. It is not midnight yet. It is simply our turn. And we're going to do what other generations before us have done. We have said no. They said no, and we will say no. We must say no to some things that now must be said no to. And they said yes to what was possible, and we must now say yes to what is possible. We must more than dream of what is possible. We must take a stand for what is possible. We must invoke what is possible. We must say yes to what is possible. We must be people of strength. We must be people of courage. We must be people of love. We must be people of mercy. We must be people of justice. We must be the angels of our better nature, not just as ideas, but brought to bear on this earth as best as we can. The people who were abolitionists were not perfect people, but they showed up. The people who were the women suffragettes were not perfect people, but they showed up. The people who were the civil rights workers were not perfect people, but they showed up. The people who are standing even today at Standing Rock, standing for the things that must be stood for today in marches, in protests all over this country for all kinds of reasons and around this world. They're not perfect people, but we're showing up. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not wait before some ideal of perfection occurs in our lives. We're not perfect yet, but you know what? And I think I can say this. I can say it about myself, and I can say it about my generation. No, we're not perfect, but we're a whole lot better than we used to be, and we're good enough. And what we're going to do in ways that will shock a lot of people, and it'll shock a lot of people around this world because they have begun to think Americans don't even know how to do it anymore. I say we will show up. Thank you very, very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.